Greetings, all. Welcome back to another episode of the Optimizer podcast. I'm excited to have our guest today. Excited and honored to have Major General Gregg Martin, the author of the Bipolar General book, a distinguished and amazing Army career. And I've been looking forward to this interview for a while. I was introduced to him via LinkedIn, and just this story is so amazing, and I can't wait to hear it directly from him. And wow, thank you, sir. Really do appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with us. I know you're busy, and we're really excited to have you on.
Well, thank you, Patrick. It's really an honor to be on and appreciate what you do.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your service. I commented real quickly before we went on air here. He's wearing the general's wearing a Kansas City Chiefs shirt, and we have a local high school football player that two of my boys played high school football with, George Karloftis, defensive end for the Chiefs, just won his second Super Bowl. So we have a very strong connection to the Chiefs in the city of West Lafayette, even though we're a Purdue Boilermaker territory here, where there's a lot of Kansas City Chiefs fans here. So you have a lot of you'll have a lot of support from people in our local area, sir.
Oh, that's great.
So, if you don't mind, maybe just jump in, and I'm sure the audience would love to hear a little bit about your background, and then we can kind of tie it into why I think it'll be so important for our police leaders and our police audience to learn from your experiences and the lessons that you've been able to glean over the years, not just from the really, I think the lessons from your book, but really just lessons in life and leadership and performing at the absolute highest levels of the United States Army. So yeah, again, thank you.
So I was born in Holbrook, Massachusetts, a suburb of Boston. And from the earliest ages, I had extraordinary energy, enthusiasm, problem-solving skills, creativity, extroversion. So what that means is that in high school, I was the all-star athlete, the honor roll student, the top leader. And then that continued. I went to West Point, more of the same, very, very high achievement, Army Ranger School, out in the Army as a lieutenant, as a platoon leader, a company commander, and so forth. Again, just extreme drive, performance, upbeat attitude all the time. And this carried me all the way through my Army career. But in writing the book and doing research, I found out that I had a condition known as hyperthymia. And what hyperthymia is, it causes the brain to produce and distribute excessive amounts of powerful chemicals like dopamine, endorphins, and others that essentially lifted me in a near continuous state of mild mania. And if you know what mania is high energy, lots of drive, all those things that are very desirable. And I was in a nearly continuous state for my whole life. And I was also on the bipolar spectrum. And so I was slowly, year by year, decade by decade, moving up the spectrum towards actual bipolar disorder. A lot of things happened in between, but like as a platoon leader, company commander, we were always the best. We won all the sports. We were the most highly trained. I was, considered an inspirational leader. The Army sent me to graduate school at MIT, and they said, your mission is to get one master's degree. Well, I came out with 2 masters and a PhD. That is not normal behavior. That is hyperthymia at its best, where I achieved to that level. My brain was functioning like a computer.
I think there's maybe some of us that would have loved that We would love to have been able to tap into that ability. That's it's almost if you could bottle that and sell it, you could probably you'd probably be a billionaire.
Absolutely. Hyperthymia, it gives a person a huge advantage. It gave me a continuous boost, an enhancement of my natural talents, and it lifted me and made me better. The problem with hyperthymia is that it goes ever upward, bringing you closer and closer to real mania, which in my case, my mania struck. My bipolar disorder, what they call an onset, was in 2003 when I was a brigade commander in the Iraq War. The year of training and preparation was very high stress. Then we were in Kuwait. When we trained and then attacked from Kuwait into Iraq, I could feel my mind just go soaring up. I felt like 100 pounds had been lifted off my shoulders. I felt like Superman. I didn't need sleep. My energy was the highest it's ever been. I was anticipating and solving problems on the battlefield before anyone else knew there was a problem. I was all over the battlefield checking on my troops and on the mission sites. So it was just remarkable. It was a high performing mania that just sent me to unbelievable levels of performance. Um, but what happened is when we came home from Iraq and the thrill and the adrenaline of combat behind us, I sunk into a 10-month long depression. And that depression was terrible. And I went to the doctor over the next few years. I went into depression like 3 times, and I went to the doctors and they said, "Oh, you're fine. You're okay." But I wasn't okay. I had bipolar disorder. I had a very sick brain. Um, and the over the next 10 years from 2003 when I was 47 in Iraq, over the next 12 years, I went into higher and higher levels of mania and lower levels of depression. Um, my condition was unknown, undiagnosed, unrecognized. And it wasn't, and I kept going higher for the 12 years until by 2014, my brain burst into full blown mania where I essentially went insane, went into a state of madness. I was over the top, out of control, off the rails, talking continuously, new ideas every minute, um, meetings running over, forgetting about things to do that I had to do, grandiosity where I thought I was the smartest guy in the world and that only I held the key to world peace, religiosity where I was doing 30 major religious events per week across 4 different churches. And I saw
Wow.
the Holy Spirit descend multiple times. And I saw demons attacking our house. And then I repelled them using Bibles, crosses, and holy water. And so at that state of full blown mania, I was essentially out of control. And my workforce sent anonymous letters to my boss, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and he decided that he had to let me go. He said, "Gregg, I love you like a brother, but your time at National Defense University is over. You have until 5 p.m. today to resign, or I'm going to fire you. And oh, by the way, I'm ordering you to get a psychiatric evaluation at Walter Reed Military Hospital." And you would have think I would have been disappointed, depressed. Instead, I
Yeah.
said, "Thank you, Chairman." Gave him a hug and said, "God put me here to do big things. He's going to put me somewhere else to do even bigger things," which 10 years later, I was right because my bipolar mission is the biggest thing I've ever done.
Well, that is such a, I mean, there's so much there that I wanted to talk about because, for our audience as police officers, um, we do there's a lot of different training that we go through throughout our career, but it really didn't start until the late 90s, early 2000s, where uh, we started to recognize that one of the more important things that we do on a daily basis is interact with people that are in crisis. Um, and a lot of times we're dealing with people in just local communities, big and small, all over the country, where we see things that presents itself as addiction, It presents itself as through multiple, maybe drugs, maybe alcohol, um, but oftentimes it's undiagnosed mental illness that's being medicated, where people are looking for a way to not just a way out, but just a way to try to calm the mind and calm the brain because they're experiencing uh, bipolar, schizophrenic type of behaviors. And I'm not a psychiatrist, just I just kind of speaking from my experience. But I think what's so unique about your situation is you're performing at the absolute highest level. This is not somebody that's working in a local community doing things that we do in every community every day. I mean, you're running entire divisions in the United States Army. So that's a pretty unique circumstance, but it also, I think, I guess to maybe your last point there, it also prevents or creates a tremendous opportunity to be able to educate and spread the word and help others maybe recognize this at a sooner time where maybe there's an opportunity for intervention and direction, if that makes
Yes,
sense.
yeah, absolutely. So I was at the top of my game. I was performing at a really high level, important jobs, but I was I had gone insane, and I had several near dangerous encounters with police officers where I think they could sense there was something wrong with me and that I was acting strangely, maybe not dangerously, but in a way that was unusual and weird. And I could tell they were really checking me out. They were watching me closely, and it wouldn't have taken much for them to arrest me at the least. Um, so it is a dangerous situation, um, and I can see that if someone had a kind of a lower station in life, acting the way I was acting, they would have probably been um, arrested or worse. Um, so it is a very dangerous situation with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Um, I would say that my position as a general gives me a unique platform and opportunity to speak, to educate, to help people and their families, friends, and work colleagues who may be going through tough times in terms of mental health. So for that, I'm thankful and I'm really taking advantage of it.
Yeah. So I'm really curious. So you, yeah, that is such a high achiever. You, not many people go to MIT to begin with, but then when you walk out of there with several degrees, not just one, as a West Point graduate, which is, it's difficult as it is enough as it is just to get into our military academies. The um, was there at any point, I guess maybe the better question is at what point, if you ever had the thought, was there ever a time where you thought something is different about me? And is this did you recognize it as something that might be wrong, or just maybe something as a gift? And I'm thinking maybe, and I'm just kind of guessing, I guess when you have a bout of depression, I think it would have been easy to assume why that I guess maybe easy to explain off, right? You just spent a year in combat with so much going on, and then you come back. I think it just that kind of that decompression period. I think maybe that people would just assume, well, it's a period of adjustment, and just after some time it'll recover. But I guess it didn't. I don't know if there's multiple questions in there, but was there a point in your mind, in your own mind, where you were wondering, okay, is there something different about me, and what might it be?
No, not until I went into depression. So for the first from teenage years up through my um, up till I was 47, never a thought that there was something wrong because I was mostly in low level mania, And when you're in low level mania, you're happy, enthusiastic, driven, energetic, extroverted, life of the party. So you feel great and you believe and you think there's nothing wrong with me. And no one would bring it up and suggest there's something wrong because you're such an overachiever. So never, ever, ever came up at all. Um, but later, after my first real mania in Iraq, when I came home and fell into this 10-month long terrible depression, then I said, there's something wrong with me. I am usually high energy, high interest, and now I'm not. What happened? What's wrong? And so over the next couple of years, when I went into depression, each time I realized there is something wrong. When I would go back into mania, I would say, there's nothing wrong. This is a gift from God to help me perform at a higher level. But when I went in for my depression, 3 times the military doctors said, you're fine. There's nothing wrong. You're fit for duty. Go back to work. But they were completely wrong. And one of the reasons that they were so wrong was when I would go in to see them, they would see a successful senior military officer with all kinds of success, and they didn't get collateral information. So they didn't talk to my wife, my kids, my work colleagues, my friends, who would have said, hey, this is really weird that he's depressed because he's always 98% of the time up, positive, if not manic. And then the doctors could have pieced it together and probably come up with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. So I didn't think there was anything wrong except in depression. And then after I got fired, I was in a state of full blown mania. I went in and got 3 psychiatric evaluations in a state of mania. And the doctors, all 3 said, you're fine, nothing wrong. And it was again the same explanation. They saw a highly successful officer and they couldn't see past that success to see that I had a very sick brain with a serious life threatening brain disease. And so 4 months later, after I had spiraled into depression, I went back to the doctor and said, hey, doc, feel terrible. There's something wrong with me. I need help. And then they got collateral information from my wife who said, I think he was manic before and now he's depressed. And then the lights went off in their head and they said, aha, from manic to depressed. And they were able to figure out bipolar disorder and gave me the correct diagnosis.
And I guess, yeah, it's probably challenging for and these were military doctors, I assume.
Yes.
And I just wonder if there is a challenge there for them, because how often would they have the opportunity to make that type of diagnosis? I just, number one, I just don't think it's one, it's not as, thankfully it's not a very common thing, but it's common enough. But in the military itself, I'm just trying to think it would be sometimes it seems like maybe that type of behavior might lead someone to get themselves into disciplinary issues or performance issues that might actually push them out of the military before they have a chance to get that diagnosis. But I guess maybe in the end, I don't know, maybe that's just me just kind of thinking out loud, but the um, and then they would at some point wind up in the VA care. um, I don't know. Am I making any sense there? I just,
Yes.
I'm not
And
trying to
so
look for an out, but it does make sense why maybe they just missed it the first time or just didn't even consider it.
Um, so remember, I was on the bipolar spectrum, ever rising, ever going higher and higher. So when I had my onset in 2003 at age 47, I was a colonel. Over the next dozen years, I continued going up that spectrum and I started doing really bizarre, weird, troublesome things that could have, if they had been reported or I'd been seen doing them, I could have resulted in, dismissal from my job, eviction from the service, etc. So there were a number of things, and I detail them in the book. Um, but then it became so egregious by 2014 that there was no mistaking that there was something, really wrong with me. And so the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who was my boss, he did an investigation, an assessment, and made the decision that I needed to go, and that he needed to have me do a mental health exam. And by the way, he did the right thing. He probably saved me, my marriage, my family. He could have saved me from a heart attack or a stroke, which are common side effects of mania. So he really did the right thing.
Yeah, because I assume it probably is associated with um, high levels of inflammation. You're going to have most likely like some pretty significant changes in blood pressure, difficulty sleeping. When this is definitely something, an area where I wanted to dive in because there are a lot of similarities between the stressors in a public safety job like policing, and we have a lot of veterans that they come out of the service and they start second careers in policing. Um, and there is a lot of stress on the job, which is similar, I think, in ways to what you might experience in the military. And so that maybe that's a question I'm really kind of curious. Um, if you think back like that time when you're in Iraq in 2003, and you're a leader, you were probably loved by your troops too. But having that energy and that enthusiasm and just the we're going to get this done. I mean, that's just, when you think about who you want to go to battle with, that's the kind of person, you'll charge any hill for. Um, yeah, do you think that experience is when in the depression, maybe on the rebound coming back, um, the stressors from the actual experience, maybe that's what triggered the ascent of the mania?
Well, bipolar disorder is a brain disease. And
Yep.
so the nature of the disease is that the brain on its own, regardless of my own will or desire, it suddenly says, I want to go into mania. And it starts to produce and distribute excessive amounts of these chemicals, which then drive you into mania, energy, grandiosity, and all the rest. Then at a certain point, the brain says, I want to go down. I want to go into depression. And it dials back and underproduces and underdistributes these same critical chemicals. And then you're driven into depression. And then there's also periods where you're at a quote normal level, like kind of a baseline. But but to your point, I think you're entirely right. I think coming out of a high stress, high adrenaline environment like combat, when all of a sudden you're not in it anymore, I think that that is probably a trigger for the brain to then go into depression. And then when you start getting ready to go into the next big thing, I think that could be a trigger to start going up again. So I think you're right.
Well, and the reason I'm asking, I've done a lot of work in the wellness space and policing over my career. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about now is this program we call The Blood Doesn't Lie. And in the policing population, we run an obesity rate now of about 80%. About 8 out of 10 police officers are overweight. And we're approaching uh, rates of, around 30% of morbid obesity. And everyone likes to make the joke, the cops like their donuts, and that's why they're overweight. But when we really start digging into this, and through some comprehensive blood tests, through an NMR. nuclear magnetic resonance test. It's kind of like an fMRI of the blood, fMRI of the blood, and we see high levels of insulin resistance in the police population. And so if you start looking at the biological mechanisms of what drives insulin resistance, then you start to understand why police officers tend to be overweight, why when they're coming out of the academy at 25 years old, or generally around that age, they're super fit, very healthy, and then by the age of 28, 30, they're 20, 30, 40 pounds heavier than they were. Then you start kind of looking at the processes that go behind this. Well, what's the one thing that police officers experience on a regular basis? It's high levels of adrenaline, it's high levels of stress, uh, poor sleep patterns, which lead to increased levels of cortisol. And so then you start looking at the intersection there of that adrenal cortico relationship and how that might impact health. And really, in its, I guess, in its simplest explanation, insulin resistance is just the first level of inflammation. It's telling you your body's inflamed and you're heading in the wrong direction. And the one thing that we know between veterans and police officers that we have in common, a very sad statistic, is high levels of suicide. The numbers are much, much higher than the general population. And I've always just been really curious if there are ways, if we looked at this from a perspective of if we can identify maybe some of these triggers early in the career and then change trajectory, if we could have an impact. And I think your case is probably just a little bit more unique than that, obviously with bipolar. But yeah, I don't know. And I don't know that there's any programs out there that, or if there's if there's something I would love to do a little bit additional research on, just to see if there is any of these connections that they're finding. But I know of one source that is kind of making some of these connections. I want to get to that in a minute, but um, yeah, it's a it just I'm thinking out loud here. This is such a an interesting case, because I also think, like in your case, where from a leadership position, when the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is getting to the position where you've got a major general that has had this such high levels of success throughout their entire career, and then we get to this point where we've hit this pinnacle. And from a leadership perspective, what a difficult position I think that would have been for him, and a difficult decision that he would have to make, but clearly did the right thing in getting you into help. Um, at what point after that did you begin to, I guess, or maybe even how, what was the process like in in your recovery, if we want to call it recovery, or maybe just understanding of what led you to that? In looking back on it now, can you kind of see a progression there and how that worked? And I just ask this because I'm curious if we have listeners here that know somebody that's displaying some of these characteristics that maybe they've had some questions or concerns about, but maybe it's just right at that threshold where, do I say something or I not say something, and how do where do I go, or how do I get this person help? I'm just trying to find a way to discuss it that maybe someone can learn something from.
Well, I would say if a person thinks that they maybe are having problems in terms of their mental health, or if they detect it with a friend, a colleague, a family member, they need to go get medical help. I mean, they have to go get medical help. And the reason is that if you have a mental condition, particularly a serious mental illness like bipolar disorder, and you don't get help, chances are it's going to ruin your marriage, your family, your career, your finances. It's going to lead to addictions, homelessness, incarceration, and then death. I mean, that's a very typical outcome for somebody who doesn't get help. So need to get help. Now, if they do get help, it's the opposite. The way professional medical community is now, they've got all kinds of good medicine and treatment, and it'll typically a person who gets diagnosed and then sticks with the plan with their doctor, there's a very good chance they can live a happy, healthy, purposeful life. And so you then you might ask, well, why wouldn't, given those choices, why wouldn't somebody get help? Well, the reason they don't get help is because of the stigma. And the stigma is based on fear and ignorance. I mean, mental illness is just as physiologically real as cancer, heart disease, diabetes. It's
Yeah.
physically real inside the cells and the wiring of the brain. So, why do we have a stigma? It makes no sense. There's no stigma against cancer or against heart disease. People just get on with it and try to recover. So that's the same way it should be for mental health. But it's not, because there's a stigma. When I remember, I got fired and then forced to retire in the summer of 2014, and then I went into terrible depression and psychosis. And I realized there's something really wrong with me. I could barely function as a human being. And I went back to the doctors and I said, "Hey, there's really something wrong." And they were able, with my wife's tidbit about mania, they were able to diagnose me with bipolar disorder type 1 with psychosis. And I was so happy. I gave the doctor a hug because I said, now you've given me a target with a face on it that I can go after and start getting smart and educated and start taking care of myself. And I, right there in that moment, I said, I am going to own my bipolar disorder. I mean, I'm going to own it. I'm going to take charge, and I'm going to do everything I can to recover. But all that said, I went from bad to worse, and I went downhill for 2 more years and lived in bipolar hell, where all I wanted to do was to die. And it wasn't until I got on the right medications and got the right treatment that I really began to stabilize and get better.
Yeah, and yeah, that's 100%. And that's um, hopefully everyone listening understands that if there's any question whatsoever, you need to get help. And I would say in law enforcement, we had very, very similar struggles that it was all if you were suffering, if you were struggling with what might be PTSD or might be, it would likely be diagnosed with PTSD today, it was always kind of the suck it up mindset. Like, hey, come on, like this is the job, just get on with it. Like, and you come day in and day out, it's the same thing. So I guess, yeah, I guess that's the question. Like, based on your experiences, what do you, what are the unique challenges that the military personnel will face regarding mental health? And because of this stigma, do you feel like they're doing a better job today than maybe they were back when you were starting to experience this? Do you think you've gotten better at that in the military culture?
Yes, the military has improved a lot, and I'll give you some examples. Um, if you go back, like when I was first came in the 70s and 80s, I mean, nobody talked about mental health. There were no classes, there was no education, there was no training, there were no resources down at the tactical levels for mental health. I mean, the closest you'd come to anybody that talked about or did mental health was up at a big regional hospital. So, and if someone did have a mental problem, they just disappeared. They just went away, and you never heard from them, never saw them again, never knew what happened. Then the 9/11 wars hit. And with the 9/11 wars, we started sending the same troops back to the on deployment after deployment. And so what happened was PTSD rose dramatically, depression rose dramatically, traumatic brain injuries rose, survivor's guilt, moral injury, bipolar disorder, all these things rose. And what the military started to do was they said, well, it doesn't make any sense to medically discharge all these people for these conditions. Let's see, how can we accommodate them? What can we do to keep a person on in the force as a service member maybe under the supervision of a doctor with medication or whatever. And so the military started making accommodations and keeping more and more people with mental health problems in the force. And today, and I've had many talks with psychiatrists, military psychiatrists, they will tell you that if a service member comes in and is being looked at for their mental health or what to do with them, they really do all they can to accommodate them and keep them in the service. But on the other hand, if you talk to an enlisted troop and say, "Hey, what are you seeing in terms of mental health?" They're going to say, "Oh, if you even go near a mental health clinic, you're blackballed. You're going to be discriminated against. Your first sergeant and your platoon sergeant are going to hold it against you, and they're going to make sure you don't get promoted and that your career is over." So the truth lies somewhere in between, which tells me the military has a long way to go and a lot of improvement still to make.
And I think it's probably the same in law enforcement. We have come a long way, and I think we really have started to recognize that. And maybe this is the question, right? From a leadership perspective, um, you there really is there has to be a reckoning at some point and I know the military is experiencing, some of the same struggles in terms of recruitment and retention, that it's a really bad problem in law enforcement now. And when uh, you spend all the time and effort, resources to get personnel trained up to be able to get out to do a job at a very high level, um, and then you just don't want to lose them for things that are preventable and things that, quite frankly, are treatable and reversible. So it really, I guess maybe the disparities in there are coming from just a lack of uniformity in the training, and then, quite frankly, leaders being willing to accept the message itself. Like, you have to take responsibility for understanding the and prioritizing the mental well-being of your troops and your officers. Um, so that kind of it the next question, I guess maybe that kind of rolls into, and you start thinking about recovery and resilience, and you when when your spouse comes with you, your wife comes with you, you help to get that diagnosis made. You have that support network there. So how important is that support network and the community support that you would get in really helping to optimize your mental health and build resilience so you can move forward?
The network is crucial. It takes a team to lift you out of a severe mental illness, and the team consists of medical professionals, spouse, family, friends. I mean, it really took a team to lift me up because I was hopeless. I mean, I had no hope that I would ever get better. I thought I would stay in bipolar hell, only wanting to die forever. I never thought it would end. Um, so and I was hospitalized, and that helped me. And then I got on the right medication, and that helped me a lot. When I got on lithium in the fall of 2016, my bipolar symptoms pretty much vanished. They went away within about 3 or 4 days, and I felt like my old self. Energy, interest, enthusiasm, all that. Um, and then I got on the road to recovery, and I call it a road to recovery because you never recover. It's never over. You're never well. Bipolar disorder is with you for life. It's a chronic disease. And so what I had to do was rebuild my life, my marriage, my family. And the way I did it was first medications to make sure my brain chemistry is stable. Second, therapy. Third is healthful living, like healthy diet, plenty of sleep, plenty of exercise, and the like. And then those three things are necessary but not sufficient to build a recovery that's built to last. And so what you need to do is anchor them on the 5 Ps. And the 5 Ps are: first, purpose. You have to come up with a purpose or a mission for your life to give you drive. Second is people. You need to surround yourself with a network of fun, happy, vibrant, energetic people to lift you up. Third is place. You need to live in a place that lets you do what you want to do with the people you want to be with. Fourth is perseverance. You have to persevere because recovery is hard and you have setbacks and you could have relapses. And then fifth is presence. Presence is the ability to objectively think about your own thinking and to realize that a lot of times what's going on in our own brains are wrong and can lead us astray. And that's called metacognition, thinking about your own thinking. So that's my strategy. That's what I do.
Well, that was you answered my next question because that was it. Share some strategies and practices that you have. And so maybe let's look at let me ask that question again in a little bit different way. Keeping those, I love that, those five P's. I'm going back and I'm writing that down, and I'm because there's a couple I want to touch on there. But if you knowing what you know now, let's take you back to 2003, and in that time frame, and then especially in your position as a leader and how you can influence not only other leaders and how that's going to spread through the organization. Um, Maybe what would be your advice today to those frontline leaders and really leaders throughout the entire organization about what's helped you maintain your mental health, what's helped you optimize your performance and your personal well-being in this professional life post recovery?
So since I got on lithium and I've started to move forward,
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm just saying, like, knowing what you know now, do you think there's anything that, and I guess maybe it's not a fair question. I'm just trying to think, like, how, what would your advice, with those five P's, if you could go back, maybe not even going backwards, but let's just say if you were, and I'm sure you do this and you, in the lessons that you impart through your book as well, but what would be your focus in discussing this with leaders today and about what they can do to help their people moving forward? Um, Really, just I guess maybe I've already answered my own question. Like, tell them to focus on the five P's.
well, I think that people need to first check themselves and look at themselves and decide, am I okay? Is there something wrong? Is there anything wrong? And in my case, most of the time, there was nothing wrong. I mean, I was doing great. I felt great. I was performing at a very high level. I was getting promoted, put in, prestigious jobs. So there wasn't anything wrong except depression. And when I went into depression, I went to the doctor to get help, but they didn't help me. Um, and so I think people need to also look at their buddies, their friends, their colleagues, their family members, and again, look at them, talk to them, and if they think they need help, get them to a doctor and volunteer to go with them. Don't send somebody off on their own, but say, "Hey, I'll go with you," and which also would give the doctor more collateral information. I would say that some of the more important things looking back, my mother told me back when I was in my 20s, she said, you know, you don't get enough sleep. You're only getting 3 and 4 hours of sleep. You need to get more sleep. Second, you drink too much alcohol and you party too much. And third, you take your work way too seriously and you're stressed out about it and you're focused on it all the time. And so, you need to improve those three things for your long-term health. And I didn't listen to her. I kept doing what I was doing, but I think she was right that if I had, forced myself to get more sleep over the years, if I had drank less alcohol, been less of kind of a party wild man, um, which is, that was due slightly to the mania. And then if I hadn't taken my work so seriously, realizing that, trying to get some balance in life, I think I would have been a healthier person over the long term. And I would recommend that to anybody coming up now. And it's not too late to start. And then I would think when you go back to the five P's, Um, you, you know, you may not need medication because maybe there's nothing wrong, and you may not need therapy, but I think having relationships where you talk to people and you can be honest and open and get advice is really important. I do think healthful living, sleep, healthy diet, exercise, all that is really important. And I think the 5 Ps apply to anybody at any state of their life. I think it will make you healthier and more fit and more resilient.
Yeah, I can't agree more, and that's why I think that's great advice. I'm the one of the first things that I always ask people, even if it comes to where I generally work with people on, in a coaching perspective, is on nutritional and lifestyle changes, just basic performance stuff. When people are struggling, one of the first questions, particularly for police officers, I ask them is tell me, how are you sleeping? That's one of the first questions I ask now is, how are you sleeping? And if it's an officer that's working night shift or they're on call and they're getting called out a lot and their sleep is being interrupted quite frequently, the first thing I'm going to talk with them about is educating them on why it's so important to get sleep and get the deep wave sleep so your brain has an opportunity to cleanse and repair and recover, because that it all starts and ends right there, right? It's so important for people. So along those lines, I'm in that fifth P, metacognition. One of the things that is really being promoted a lot in the police, I know just in the general wellness space, but is the practice of mindfulness and meditation. And I think the old guard would kind of look at that as, hey, that's really, it's that's people kind of viewed it in a negative way, like, oh, that's kind of like this, very, I don't know what the word I'm looking for is, but it it's something that, a little flighty, maybe a little hippie-ish. But the data and the science now is so strong and so clear that just through a good breath work, mindfulness protocol, once or twice a day, you get good at it. You can reset your physiology. You can actually change the structure of your brain. Do you have a mindfulness or a meditation practice that you do with, in working on the metacognition that you mentioned?
Um, Yoga is one, and then another one is these breathing techniques, which so I think both of them are good, and they do what you said.
That's so one of my first episodes that's airing this season, is with an author named James Coomer who wrote a book, the Practical Guide to Breath Work. And I had another chief of police on, and we had a very similar conversation, and um, he heard me speaking at a conference where we were talking about the labs and the blood work, and it kind of led him down a path where he was seeking out some of these answers on his own, and he got connected, with James, and then started the breath work, and now they're running clinics for first responders, which I think is amazing. But police officers run in, with same with veterans, and those in the military, high levels of hypervigilance where you're in a high state of readiness a lot. But if you stay up in that area and you don't give yourself time to recover, that's when you can crash afterwards, and it can lead to problems. And I think if we had known how powerful that practice could be 20 years ago, I think we really could have saved a lot of heartache and potentially even a lot of lives by teaching people that protocol. So I love to hear that. And the other P, that when you were mentioning, like, when you're surrounding yourself with happy, positive, energetic people in policing, we go out and we deal with people that are at their, that are in crisis all the time or at their worst. And there's rarely a call where you go, and I like to joke, people don't call us just to come out and say, hey, sit down, have a cup of coffee with me, tell me about how your day's going. Bad things are happening. People are dying, get shot, stabbed, overdosing, all these things, and that's a lot of negative energy for police officers to carry. And sometimes cops have a tendency to do maybe like what you did in your youth, um, not so much as we used to, but medicate with alcohol, um, try go through the recovery process. Really involved hanging out with other cops that have experienced the same things, and not maybe necessarily talking through those issues, but talking over those issues over a few beers, which then impacts your sleep, which then negatively, sends you in that spiral, and you're not necessarily recovering before you get up and do it all over again the next day. And I think that leads to issues. So surrounding yourself with positive people, I think is great advice as well. I guess that wasn't really a question. That was just really me more on a ramble. Uh, so when you think about like the future and future goals and advocacy, obviously you've written a book and you've shared that story. Um, what do you think your goals are with writing the book, and what are you hoping some of the outcomes might be by educating, particularly, I think maybe within the military itself, since it's coming from, you're such a high level officer. Uh, do you have some hopes and aspirations for what might happen in the future?
Yes. So my mission or my purpose in life is sharing my bipolar story to help stop the stigma, promote recovery, and save lives. And the ways that I do it are number one, speaking, podcasts, interviews, talks, etc. Writing. I've written over 20 articles are on my website, plus the book, which is like kind of my biggest achievement. And then third is conferring, where you meet with people and you talk about this stuff. So my biggest thing is to be brutally honest about my story, pull no punches, and be just the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that people hear it and it startles people. It's in many regards. General McChrystal, Stan McChrystal said the book is at once terrifying, inspiring, and educational. And so, I want to shock people about how bad bipolar disorder is. Um, but I want them to learn the lessons that they can apply to themselves, their family, their friends, their work colleagues. And I want people to realize that bipolar disorder and other mental illness is physically real, that it is not due to a lack of willpower or a lack of character. And in doing that, I think I can help reduce and end the stigma, which is the biggest problem with mental health, that people don't go in to get help because they're embarrassed, they're ashamed. So those are the things that I'm hoping to do. I always, when somebody asks me to speak or do a podcast or an interview, I always say yes. I've never said no, which keeps me really busy. Writing, I did the book. When people ask me to, like I was just asked a week ago, to write a chapter in a book on mental health and veterans. So I said, yes, I'll do it. I'm too busy to do it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And I've been asked to be, to speak at numerous conferences and so forth. And it's the military who is interested. It's the veterans community. It's the professional medical community who I'm very impressed with. They have been just overwhelmingly interested and supportive of the book and the story. But it's also businesses, Fortune 500 companies, and then just the general population, first responders and others. So, that's really what I'm trying to do.
Well, thank you. I really do appreciate you sharing your message, and I certainly appreciate you not turning down podcast opportunities. Um, so yeah, D- um, that I mean that kind again, you're a step ahead of me. See, um, in terms of like support systems for veterans, for first responders, um, how do you think we can optimize them? Being this is the Coptimizer podcast to really better address the complex needs of people that are dealing with these kind of issues. And I think a lot of them I think a lot of it really it's not just bipolar, right? PTSD and other um, associated, I guess, disorders that could be classified more broadly as, as mental health. I mean, do you have any ideas for how you think we can make systems work better?
Yes. First point is yes, this is not just bipolar disorder. It's all mental illnesses, mental challenges across the spectrum because they all have serious consequences and can really debilitate the person who's dealing with them. As far as what to do about it systematically, number one, I think we need to start educating kids at a young level about mental health. We don't have to give them, a psychiatric degree, but just give them the basics, like we do in physical fitness and health, which we start at a very, very young level, so that kids know, running is good, working out is good, eating vegetables is good. Don't pig out on potato chips and Coke. We teach this stuff, and we should do the same thing with mental health. Then, as people progress, and you take the level of a police force or a military organization, we should up the training. We should up the education. We should normalize talk about mental health so that it's not a taboo subject. And in the training, everybody should know what are the basic symptoms of the most common mental disorders. What are they? So, for in bipolar disorder, you have mania and you have depression. What does mania look like? Well, it's grandiosity, it's religiosity, it's super energy, it's not sleeping, so and on and on. And then what is depression? Depression is, you're down, you have no energy, no interest, you're confused, you're withdrawn, you're indecisive, etc. You want to die. And so everybody has that basic knowledge. And then you assign, in the military, they call them battle buddies. In the civilian world, they call them peer support specialists. But every person should have a battle buddy or a peer support specialist who is their person. You get to know each other, you trust each other, you tell it straight, you don't, hold any retribution when someone gives you bad news about yourself. And so the battle buddy keeps an eye on their battle buddy to make sure they're okay. They talk regularly about what they're seeing. And then if there is a problem, then they say, the battle buddy says, hey, look, I'm noticing the following things with you that are troubling me. Let's go see the therapist or the social worker or maybe a psychiatrist. I will go in with you. Let's invite your spouse and a family member and another friend. So we've got a group of people. We can have a discussion with the doctor, and he or she can see the full picture of who you are as a person and hopefully come up with either a correct diagnosis or that there's nothing wrong with you. And so those are some of the things that I think need to be done systemically.
Yeah, that's great. Just an interview that I just did yesterday with a fellow police chief here in Indiana. He's had the really unfortunate experience of where he's had three of his officers killed in the line of duty, which is uh, disproportionately very high. And we were talking about the toll that takes on the individual, on the leader, and really as in the organization. I'm really glad you brought that up because that was one of the recommendations that he made. And we're seeing this a lot in the policing community where agencies are starting to hire peer support specialists, not just to work with, not to go with them on calls that are associated with uh, people in crisis, but also to assist internally with officers who are trying to manage stress and high stress. And so the resource can be outward facing, but it can also be utilized inwards in terms of having that resource right there for them to be able to someone that they can chat with and be very candid with, and do it in a protected and safe environment where they're not worried about, who's going to hear about this, or is the chief going to find out, that kind of thing. Because you're right that does lead people to sometimes not speak up when they know that they probably should, or they think there's a problem because they're worried about retribution or what might happen. So I do think that we're getting better at that. Um, so I know we're already at an hour. This is going fast, and I got a lot more. I have a lot more questions that I want to ask, but I was curious. And you mentioned the nutrition side of things, not eating potato chips and getting out and exercising. Now this is really my language that you're speaking because I do have big concerns about hyperpalatable foods, about the different chemicals and the things that are put into processed foods today. And I just don't know that we understand, scientifically speaking, what the long-term ramifications of that might be. And one quick example, just this morning, I watched a story from the BBC where they took two twin women. I believe they were 20, and they fed them over a 2-week period. They fed them a diet that was identical in a macronutrition content, meaning the fat, the proteins, and the carbohydrates were the same in both. However, one came from Whole Foods and another came from what we would consider probably the standard American diet now that had a lot of processed foods in it. And they did a bunch of biometric measurements. They did lab work on day one, and then they did it in 2 weeks, a 2-week follow-up. And within 2 weeks, the the girl that was on the Whole Foods plan actually lost just over a kilo. The twin sister that was on the highly processed foods gained over a kilo, and the lipid profile in both went in opposite directions. The processed food um, twin had significant increase in her LDL and some of the other, really a negative trend in her lipids. But I think where it was more important was when they were interviewing them at the end, the twin that was on the processed foods, she said she felt depressed at the end of the day, and she just felt like she had really low energy and she was hungry a lot. She just didn't feel good. And it just I mean, and we're talking 2 weeks. And you mentioned earlier, like it's never too late to start. And I guess maybe the question there and the observation is knowing that if you can start today, you can make improvements for how tomorrow is going to feel. But what's your thought on nutrition and exercise, maybe a little bit more in depth about what you think, how you think that's important for improving just the mental well-being.
Well, I'm not an expert on the science of it, so mine is kind of a relatively common man answer. I mean, we know that exercise is good for you. The combination of cardiovascular strength training, um, flexibility, all that stuff. We know scientifically for decades that has proven health results. We also know that the movement is very good for the brain. It gets chemicals and blood flowing through the brain in a very healthy way that's good for mental health. Food, the what's considered a healthy diet seems to change continuously. So I'm not going to try to prescribe a diet. I would say for a person, do some research on what constitutes a really healthy diet. And for lack of other knowledge, I would say a healthy dose of protein with green leafy multicolored vegetables, limited amounts of starch, really limit sugar, dessert, soda, things like that are just going to contribute sugar that's going to probably turn into fat. So you want to have this, like the Mediterranean diet is one that's been held up to me as being, stood the test of time, very, very healthy, very positive. So I would do something. I would look it up, do some research, talk to some experts, talk to some nutritionists, some health coaches, and get a diet systematically put in place that's going to really provide you with the nutrients and the fuel that you need to be healthy.
Yeah, that's great advice. The Mediterranean diet really has stood the test of time. And a lot of that is just because of the macros, the way that it breaks down for all the reasons, right? It's healthy, healthy fats, good source of protein, good source of macronutrients. The then I don't I like to ask. Obviously, you're a prolific reader, and that's something that's just been a part of you. So, and before I change gears too much, I don't know if you've ever heard of this book, or maybe you've heard of Dr. Chris Palmer. There's a group that I participate with, around the country, where we're looking at these, taking a metabolic approach to improving performance and performing and improving health. But he's been introduced into our network, and he wrote this book called Brain Energy. And he is a psychiatrist. He's from Harvard. He's right there in your backyard from your in your Boston days. But he's taken he uses a ketogenic approach, a high fat, low carb nutrition approach towards treating certain psychiatric disorders, and he's had tremendous success. And I know it's not just all about like the diet, but have you ever heard of Chris Palmer?
No, I haven't, but I heard of the ketogenic diet and did that for a good while, and still do a modified version of it.
So my backyard neighbor, sadly she passed. She had lung cancer and passed, but Sarah Hallberg was her name, and she did the largest clinical study that had ever been done at the time, where she reversed type 2 diabetes through a nutritional intervention. And you can read about it. She ran a weight loss clinic for IU Medical Centers here in our area, and then also later became involved with Virta Health. And that their mission is to reverse type 2 diabetes, and over I think it's 1 million people is what their goal is. But in conversations that I had with her, just she was such an amazing human being. But the nutritional pathways, there are a lot of times, and that's why what you said really stuck to me, stuck out, is make sure you do your own research and make sure that you have a plan for what you're going to do. And this is, again, it goes back to a lot of the work that we do with police officers. Is I really, really recommend that they get their labs done. We look at a lot of different data in their labs, but yeah, before you make a big nutrition change, or you're going to do a big lifestyle intervention, knowing what your baseline is and then being able to see which way your markers go based on what you're eating and what you're doing is really important, because everybody is a little bit different. And while I'm a big believer in the ketogenic diet, for particularly for people that are diabetic, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistant, I think it can be a great tool. But I think there's always people in the population too where that might not be the best choice. So always getting your labs and consulting with a physician that understands what that protocol can do is really good. Um, Again, I guess that's probably more of an observation than anything else. Um, so we've been going for an hour and 15 minutes here, so I want to be respectful of your time. So you have your website, and we'll put that in the show notes when the show goes. Your book is The Bipolar General. But what are, in terms of like in thinking about public safety and the veteran community, what might be, I guess, your final thoughts, or like the big pieces of wisdom that you might want, or anything that you haven't mentioned already that you think that we should all consider, and particularly from a leadership perspective, what do you think leaders should focus on, and why is it important for leaders to uh, educate themselves on mental illness and how they can best support their people?
First of all, stigma is the enemy. Stigma is based on fear and ignorance, and it holds people back from getting help, and it leads to their destruction. So anything people can do to end stigma, and it's typically through education, training, and personal example. Like if the commander never talks about mental health or mental wellness, or never is open and honest with people, he or she is perpetuating stigma. Um, so that's one thing. I would say it's important to um, be compassionate to people that have some kind of mental disorder, realizing that it's physiological. It's not due to a lack of willpower, or they're lazy or they're not trying hard enough, and help them to get help. And then do everything you can to accommodate people who have come forward and do have a problem. Normalize the talk. Mental health should be held on an equal footing as physical health. And in fact, it is physical health because you're talking about the health of the brain, which is a physical organ inside the skull. So it is. Um, you know, 50 years ago, breast cancer was considered shameful, embarrassing, and it was stigmatized. And First Lady Betty Ford, she opened up about her breast cancer, and it changed the whole culture so that now, 50 years later, people view breast cancer fighters as heroic warriors. Pro football players wear pink socks and pink shoes. Um, I mean, those are some of the things, but I think it's important to realize people think, oh, it's never going to happen to me. That's totally wrong. 20% of the world population is afflicted by some sort of mental illness. 20% afflicted, meaning they have it. The other 80% are affected because they're family, friends, or work colleagues. So 20 plus 80, that's 100% of the world population are afflicted or affected or somehow touched by mental illness. So it touches everybody. I've given, probably close to 100 talks. And when I asked how many people have been touched by something in mental illness, family, friend, yourself, whatever, I mean, just about every hand goes up. Every hand, everybody has somebody. So you're not alone. And, treating people, knowing that fact, I think is super important. I would also say it's really important to turn to valuable resources. I mean, I would, take it from the medical school professors who are using my book to teach psychiatry and mental illness in med school. Many of them have said it's the best book they've ever read on mental illness, mental health. So, I mean, check out, my book. Check out other books. Nasir Gami wrote a fabulous book called um, uh, A First Rate Madness, uncovering the links between leadership and mental health. There's a film going to come out a year from now. It'll be a PBS documentary on bipolar disorder. Watch informative films and read informative things. Um, there's a uh, there's a professor at the University of Illinois named Professor Alex Liao. She has invented a keyboard device that goes on an iPhone that can track mood disorders. And so you can see if you're migrating towards mania or depression, go to a doctor and get help much faster than you otherwise could. But I mean, it's called byeffect.com. You look it up, you can see it, her and what she invented. Um, there's another company called it's grithope.com. Grithope.com. They've been around 20 years. They work with first responders, military, VA, universities, foreign countries, and they specialize in resilience and mental wellness. And they've got all kinds of products and opportunities and learning devices to help make people better in this area. So I would say tap into some of these resources.
That's awesome. I was writing some of those down. As soon as we're done here today, I'm gonna look them up. University of Illinois.
The documentary film that's coming out next year, you can Google brainstormthefilm.com, and that'll tell you about what this film will be about. Brainstormthefilm.com. It's going to be probably the best film ever made on bipolar disorder.
Great. Yeah, I really appreciate those resources, and I know our listeners will as well, and I'll get the links and we'll put those in the show notes so everybody when the show goes, everyone can see them and look for themselves. And obviously, I want them to start with your book, The Bipolar General. I think I showed everybody, and I've talked about this book in the past before, Brain Energy. I think it's really one of the best out there in terms of connecting some of the relationship between nutrition and mental illness and lifestyle, and really developing new I think strategies for improving treatment for things like bipolar and anxiety and depression, things that a lot of first responders and their families are going to experience. And yeah, just to touch on, you mentioned it. Everybody knows somebody that is affected by this in one way or another. The data, unfortunately, is trending in the wrong direction. We're seeing increasing rates um, of mental illness, and it's starting at a much younger age. We haven't even talked about cell phones and digital technologies and the influence that that might have on the mental well-being, particularly for our youth, and some of the struggles that we're seeing there. But it's all interconnected, it's all interrelated, and I think the biggest lesson that I'm going to take away from what you've imparted on us today is really about awareness, self-awareness, and then also being aware of others around you. So I got to find a battle buddy. I got to find a battle buddy. I've got a lot of buddies, but I'm gonna designate one of them to be my battle buddy. Like, you got to tell it to me straight and let me know when I'm going off the rails. My wife is really good at letting me know when I'm going off the rails. So when she says, get it together. Um, so maybe I need to find someone outside the household. All right, sir. We've taken up a lot of your time. The last question I want to ask, is there a question that I didn't ask you that I should have? We covered a lot of ground.
Um, I think the question would be, do these diseases just strike a particular kind of person? And the answer is no. They strike black and white, male and female, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, janitors and CEOs, privates and generals. It can hit anybody, so no one is exempt. And although most onset of bipolar disorder is from 18 to 25, mine was at age 47. It's called late onset. You can continue to get onset of bipolar disorder and other mental illness, well into your 40s, 50s, and 60s.
There you have it, folks. And we've gotten a lot of good resources. Sir, thank you very much. I really do appreciate you spending some of your valuable time with us, imparting your wisdom, imparting your life story to help improve the lives of not just veterans, but everybody moving forward. I really do appreciate you sharing your story. I know it's been impactful to me, and I know when others grab your book and read it, I know they're going to share it, and I think we'll see the ripple effect of that positive energy moving out from here. So thank you very much for being here today.
You're most welcome, Patrick. Thanks for having me on, and keep up the great work. It's important.
All right, everybody. That concludes this episode of the Coptimizer podcast. Until the next episode, we'll be 1042.